Hello, and welcome again to the Last Day Book Club, where we are reading The Miracle of the Seventh Day Ox by Bradley Booth, the story of a Russian SDA pastor imprisoned in a Siberian prison camp for his faith, where he refuses to work on the Sabbath, enduring instead whatever punishment is meted out to him for that choice. In our last reading, God worked a remarkable miracle, giving old Maxim the ox energy and power to haul 16 barrels of water on Friday, the last day they had to meet their quota, of which they were far short on Thursday. If Nikolai and Maxim could meet their quota, then they would have their Sabbath off, as was promised to Nikolai by the general. Nikolai rejoiced, realizing that it was not by his own strength and determination, but only by the power of God that this came to pass. It gave him an opportunity to witness to the whole camp, and especially to Petya the cook, who was now leaning heavily towards accepting God. But on the second week, Maxim was back to his old tricks, and try as he might, Nikolai could not get him to move any faster. And on Thursday evening, they were again far short of their goal, and Nikolai's faith began to wane. The Miracle of the Seventh Day Ox, Chapter 31. On Friday morning, Nikolai didn't even bother to get out of bed early. What was the point? It wouldn't be possible for them to finish the job by sunset anyway. There were just too many barrels of water to bring into camp by the time the Sabbath would begin. It didn't seem to matter that Nikolai had prayed and worked hard all week again, stretching every fiber of his being to add to the number of barrels needed. It had all been for nothing. Finally, just after dawn, Nikolai got up and headed for the kitchen. There was no sense of urgency now. He could afford to get some breakfast this morning. On his way to the kitchen, another prisoner called out to him, "You'd better go to the stables and check out that old ox. I think he's gone crazy. He's making a lot of racket in there." Nikolai stopped in his tracks. He wanted to ignore the man's announcement, but a faint hope of something a week old flickered in his heart. It wasn't possible, was it? Could Maxim be thinking of trying to run a repeat performance? Nikolai turned and headed for the stables, and the closer he got, the more optimistic he became. Old Maxim was indeed going berserk, if that was really him making all the noise. It sounded as if he was trying to pull the stable down, posts and all. "I don't believe it," Nikolai yelled, rushing through the open stable door. There stood Maxim, yanking on his chain and pawing at the ground impatiently. Nikolai surveyed the scene for only a moment, and then he flew into action. If old Maxim wanted to haul water barrels, then that is what they would do. It was later than Nikolai would have liked it to be, and he wished with all his heart now that he had gotten up by faith and done his part. But he had not, so he had to make up for the hour or so he had wasted in bed, if God would be so merciful. It was a strange and almost comical feeling Nikolai had as he hurriedly unhooked Maxim from his chain, threw the harness over his neck and shoulders, and hitched him to the ox cart. All week, He had worked early and late to accomplish his purpose. It had been all he could think of, day and night. But then, when things didn't turn out as he had planned, his faith had floundered, and he had lost sight of his goal. What a shame. Nikolai scolded himself over and over. Now, when he desperately needed to be up and on his way, he had been sleeping on the job. "Forgive me, Lord," he fervently prayed. "I'm not worthy of your goodness. Help me to make up for the lost time. Help Maxim to do his part. He's more worthy of your grace than I am." Nikolai heaved a sigh as he checked the rope that held the barrel securely in place. Sometimes dumb animals weren't so dumb. At least they knew how to listen to God's voice. He thought about the story of Balaam and his donkey again, and how God had worked through the actions of an animal. When Balaam couldn't see God's will, a willing donkey had. And now it appeared God was ready to use Maxim again. The ox was willing. It was the man who lacked the faith. In short order, they were off to the spring. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen the ox running full tilt out of camp, his tail flying and the cart bouncing along behind him, and the man running for all he was worth to keep up. It was as if the ox were on a mission, and indeed he was. No longer did it appear as if the man were in charge. Clearly, the ox was in control and determining the pace at which they would work. On and on he ran as if in a frenzy, as if he had somehow lost his mind. Again, Nikolai felt it was the strangest thing he had ever seen. It was as if the angels had built a fire on the old Maxim and ignited his spirit to fulfill God's will and greatest wish, that Nikolai be rewarded for his desire to honor God's holy Sabbath. All week, it had been Nikolai who had been pushing them hard to bring extra barrels of water to the kitchen, always mindful that they needed a tally of 70 barrels in order to make the mark. And all week, Maxim had done his part, but more often than not, he had worked with less energy than Nikolai wished he would. Now, it was Friday again, the preparation day, and Maxim was on a mission. The trip to the spring for that first load of water was run in record time. It was not a complete surprise that Maxim was running helter-skelter to and from the spring. Nikolai had witnessed him acting this way the previous Friday, but it was a shock that he was doing it for the second week in a row. It helped to remove any doubt in Nikolai's mind that such a thing might have been a freak accident the week before. As Nikolai ran, panting behind the cart all the way to camp, he had to admit that God works in mysterious ways. As everyone in the camp watched Nikolai and Maxim, it confirmed in their minds, even more than the week before, that the God of heaven was again working on Nikolai's behalf. How else could it be interpreted? Since entering the camp, Nikolai had been a living testimony of determination and loyalty. The colors of his character were beginning to become obvious to everyone, prisoners and guards alike. Even the warden had been forced to admit that here was a man of the highest caliber, one who would rather suffer persecution and pain than dishonor the God that he served. And now, again, they were witnessing a miracle in action, evidence of the power that God was willing to demonstrate on Nikolai's behalf. It was a strange and unusual sight. Man and ox running full speed into the camp, the ox cart rolling along with 2 full barrels of water on board. And it was equally bizarre to see Maxim turn the ox cart around and head back to the spring as soon as the full water barrels were taken off and the empty ones dropped into place. And then the whole performance would repeat itself again as man and beast were seen speeding out of the camp and across the wide open spaces of the Siberian steppes. The end of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. All that morning, Nikolai and Maxim worked, sweat pouring from their bodies. It was an amazing and almost comical sight. As the two could be seen approaching the camp, someone would always signal their arrival with a shout, "Here they come again!" And then everyone within range would stop whatever it was they were doing, prisoners and guards alike. Petya would always come out of the kitchen for a look. It was a great way to take a break. By the time Nikolai and Maxim returned to the camp the 3rd time, everyone was cheering and throwing their caps into the air. Nikolai hardly had time to notice their shouts of encouragement. He did give a tired salute on his entry into the camp, and then another wave of his arm again as the cart spun around to make its next trip to the spring. If Nikolai had been watching on the 4th trip back to camp, he would have noticed that even the warden had stopped what he was doing to come out and see the amazing spectacle. By noon, they were already heading out for their 5th trip to the spring. As Nikolai hurried to catch up with the ox, Petya ran alongside him and handed him a small bag with cold turnips and Russian black bread in it. Nikolai had managed to drink a little water each time they stopped at the spring and the camp, but he had not thought of eating. Now he realized that he was famished, and he was so grateful for the friendship of this man who was watching out for him. He ate the turnips as he ran, praying that God would help the food to digest in spite of the conditions in which he was eating the meal. On the return trip, Nikolai saw 4 or 5 of the prairie wolves come out and sit in a row to watch the man and the ox race by. He tossed a chunk of the black bread to the wolves and watched them fight over it as the cart raced away to the east. The miles became easier to run and his breathing less strenuous. It was as though God was giving Nikolai a 2nd and 3rd wind so he could become a part of the miracle in action. The day melted away as trip after trip was made until there was only one last run. By now, the man and the beast were running in tandem, as though this adventure had turned them into a well-oiled machine. And they finished the task with time to spare. By the time the sun dipped below the western horizon, Nikolai had unloaded the last barrel of water, gone to the barracks to clean up, and was on his way to the kitchen to eat the evening meal he knew Petya would have waiting for him there. What a day it had been, and what a lesson in faith for Nikolai. In his heart, he knew that he would never again doubt God's amazing watch care and his ability to come to the aid of a soul in need. Of course, Nikolai believed in the power of God to protect and preserve, and he knew of God's willingness to act on behalf of his children in time of need. But he had never experienced such a dramatic display of God's power to vindicate one of his children. And to everyone in camp, this had been a clear demonstration of the lengths to which Nikolai's God would go to honor the pastor for his faithfulness. As Nikolai sat in the kitchen, eating a hot bowl of borscht and sipping a cup of tea, the cook spoke of the electricity that had ignited the camp. "You did it again," Petya exclaimed. "It was amazing." "We did it," Nikolai countered. "Maxim and I did it, and we owe it to God, from whom all blessings flow." Petya shook his head in disbelief. "I wish you could have seen the two of you," he crowed. "What a sight!" He handed Nikolai another slice of black bread. "You two are like celebrities here in the camp now. I don't suppose the warden will ever give you trouble again. He can't. The guards wouldn't let him." On his way back to the barracks, Nikolai stopped to watch the moon rising in the east. The orange oval of light looked warm and inviting, like the feeling he had in his chest. For the first time since arriving in camp more than 2 years ago, he felt exhilaratingly free, and God was responsible for it. It had taken a while for Nikolai to see his prayers fully realized, but in the end, things had worked out for the best, with God being justified and Nikolai feeling vindicated. Nikolai decided that it was always best to trust fully in God's timing, because only God could see the end from the beginning. As Nikolai turned to enter the barracks, he could hear the prairie wolves howling somewhere in the distant darkness. But the sound no longer made him feel lonely. He remembered feeling lost and forlorn when he had first arrived in the camp. The sound of prairie wolves had left him feeling empty, and he had even been tempted to feel abandoned by God. But not any longer. Clearer than ever before was his faith in Jesus. It was a moment of truth for him, and it thrilled him through and through to know that God was with him, even on the wastelands of the Siberian tundra. To have a peace like that was truly worth dying for. But of course, it didn't look as if that was what God required now. He had stood the test, and he had come through shining. The end of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. Nikolai reaped the benefits of the second Friday miracle even more than he had the first. Again, he spent time in prayer, thanking God for his wonderful gift of rest on the holy Sabbath day. Again, he had a chance to escape his labors of the week. All that following week, Nikolai and Maxim worked together to bring the needed water to the camp. And all that week, strangely enough, Maxim worked at a normal pace. It was amazing The slow pace at which Maxim persisted in working Sundays through Thursdays was almost as phenomenal as his working to beat the band on Friday. But by Friday sunset, the extra 10 barrels of water for the Sabbath were again ready and waiting at the kitchen. The whole thing was a spectacular miracle to Nikolai. As the weeks passed, Nikolai and Maxim settled into their routine. Sundays through Thursdays always brought just a little bit of consternation to Nikolai. Why did Maxim have to poke along all week and then run lickety-split on Fridays? What was he trying to prove? Didn't the ox ever learn? Or was that it at all? Was Maxim just operating, in fact, on the instinctive impressions that the Holy Spirit was giving him? But there was another thing. Nikolai always felt funny, knowing that on Friday, the ox would be performing his marathon run. It made him feel presumptuous and just a little bit guilty, knowing that he could relax and just let God make the Friday miracle happen. But it was out of Nikolai's hands, and apparently that's the way God wanted it. In the final scope of things, Nikolai's worries had ended up being fairly redundant anyway. What was most important now was the fact that man and ox were proving to be a real witness at the prison camp. The weather turned cooler in August, with more rain falling than Nikolai remembered from previous years. Many days he had to work in the rain, and he suffered from the dampness of it all. Some days, the rain turned to sleet and ice, and on the days it didn't rain, frost fell thick and hard. Petya lent him a raincoat, for which Nikolai was grateful. What would he have done without such a friend? After work, many evenings, Nikolai spent time talking to Petya. Sometimes they talked in the kitchen, sometimes in the barracks. Sometimes they talked late into the night. But they talked less and less of prison life and more about eternal things. One evening in the kitchen, Petya came right to the point. You've been such an inspiration to me since you came to this camp. You have suffered so much for God, and yet you're still faithful to Him. I'm so inspired by the hope that you have brought to us all. Petya stared at the floor solemnly. Can you help me find this peace that you carry with you everywhere you go? I want the power of this peace in my life too. Nikolai laid his hand on Petya's shoulder. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, he said. If you do this, you will have God's peace when you need it most. You've said that before. Petya raised his eyes to stare at Nikolai unbelievingly. Can it be true that it's really that simple? God has made it simple, Petya. He's not willing that anyone should perish. Trust me on this one. It's the one thing that has always given me courage to live for Him every day. Nikolai rubbed his tired eyes. Petya blew out the kerosene lamp and then closed the door to the kitchen. As the two men stepped out into the night, the moon was full, rising quickly from the horizon. Not a sound could be heard, except the mournful call of a snowy owl somewhere in the night. "I want to be baptized," Petya suddenly announced. His voice was soft, but there was a note of determination in it. "I believe in everything you've told me, because I've seen the power of God in your life." Nikolai looked at Petya in surprise. This man had gleaned more from their conversations than he would have guessed. There was silence for several moments as Nikolai caught his breath. "Praise God," he finally said, and then bowed his head in reverence. Petya was giving his heart to Jesus. The very thought of it made Nikolai's heart race. Was this to be his first convert in Siberia? After 3 long years in this prison camp, was the fruit of his labor finally going to pay off? "Would there be some way you could baptize me?" Petya continued. Yes, of course," Nikolai quickly replied. But it was more of an attempt to assure himself than Petya. "Where will we find enough water?" "Well, there's the water we bring to the camp," Nikolai thought for a moment. "But the barrels aren't big enough to submerge you." "What about the spring? Isn't there enough water there?" "Yes, of course, but the water isn't deep. I'd have to dig it deeper." "Can you do it, Pastor?" Nikolai put his hand on Petya's shoulder and smiled. It was the first time Petya had referred to him personally as Pastor. "We'll get it done, Petya. I will dig the spring deeper. Maybe a little bit every time I go out to the spring for the barrels of water. We will find a way." The end of chapter 33 of the miracle of the seventh day ox.